guys, it's Tori and the time has finally arrived. I have finished all of Hardy's novels and it is time for me to rank them. So I don't want this video to take forever. Suffice it to say, if you are new to my channel, don't know, I love Thomas Hardy. He's one of my favorite authors of all time, and this year I had 4 books of his left to read, 4 of his full-length novels, and so I decided to just finish them off. Finally have, and now I'm going to be ranking all 14 of them. So without further ado, let's just get into this, because like I said, I mean my Jane Austen ranking, it was only 6 books, and that took a ridiculously long amount of time. So let's just get into this so this doesn't take forever. Starting from the bottom, we start with The Well-Beloved by Thomas Hardy, and I gave this 1 star when I read it, so if that tells you anything, I really did not like this much at all. The story follows a man named Jocelyn who is obsessed with this idea of the well-beloved, who is this basically like an incorporeal woman that comes into different women's bodies throughout his life, and he's kind of a player basically and finds himself attracted to different women all the time, but to him he's loyal to his well-beloved, and so somehow that makes him loyal. No, it doesn't. But anyway, so he kind of grows, we follow him from his youth on up through his old age, and he ends up being involved with this family, and he actually starts off kind of with a relationship with the first generation. There's 3 generations that are involved. He starts out being involved with the first generation, and then he continues to be involved with his family in romantic ways. And it's just an odd story. I feel like it was a thought experiment for Thomas Hardy. I know he had a lot of problems with marriage himself, and I just feel like this was him almost trying to make an excuse for himself or make himself feel better about the fact that he wasn't loyal to his wife and that he struggled so much in marriage. But it's just a strange book. It's interesting. I honestly would be willing to reread it at some point just because I think as I get to know Hardy himself better, it will be interesting to come back to, but it's a weird book and definitely not great, not one I would recommend to anyone unless they just wanted to finish all of Hardy's works. In spot number 13, we have A Pair of Blue Eyes. Now this one I enjoyed better for sure than I enjoyed The Well-Beloved. I just feel like the characters don't grip me as much as a lot of the other ones. It's also, I don't know, the ending in this one, a lot of Hardy's other endings, even though they can be jarring, I still end up appreciating them in some ways, but this one just felt kind of lazy on Hardy's part, like he wasn't able to make a decision for his main female character as to what should happen to her, and so he just kind of took the easy way out a little bit with it. That makes it sound so sad. In some ways I did like the ending, and it actually went in a direction that I expected, but I just feel like I would have liked to see a little bit more from this story. I think that's the biggest, I don't know precisely what I wanted to see from this story, but I just wanted a little bit more than what it gave me. The other thing about this that kind of turns me off is the fact that Hardy heavily based his female main character in this on his own wife. For her sake, I feel a little uncomfortable about that, and it makes me sad to see how he kind of portrayed her in some ways. Not that she's portrayed terribly, but I could see why she would be uncomfortable with it, and so that kind of turns me off of this story as well. As far as a synopsis, there's not much to say beyond that there's this girl who kind of ends up in a romantic entanglement with one man who's poorer and a little less educated, and then she also develops feelings for another man who is more educated, and we'll just stick with that. I will also say a little fun fact about this one actually, the word cliffhanger actually came from this book. There's a chapter, which this was serialized, so it was basically a week's worth of a portion of the story, ended with one of the characters literally hanging off a cliff, and so the word cliffhanger came into being. So interesting fact about this. But yeah, it's good, but I just wanted a bit more. Up next we have Under the Greenwood Tree, and this one, honestly, this one and A Pair of Blue Eyes could kind of switch off in a lot of ways. but for now I'm going to put this one ahead of A Pair of Blue Eyes just because I do feel like the ending in this one is more interesting to me, is more thought-provoking to me than the ending in A Pair of Blue Eyes. I felt like it was just very intriguing how Hardy ended this story. This story is an interesting one because there is a romance, there is a bit of a love triangle sort of romance going on in this with a girl who is very educated and she falls for a man who is not very educated, and it explores that a little bit. But it also has kind of like a parallel plot going on. I would say a side plot, but also there's a lot of focus put on it of just this choir, this local choir, who are concerned when the local church leader ends up bringing in an organ or a piano. I can't remember what it is, but they bring in this musical instrument, so the choir is no longer really needed, and so this local choir is kind of rebelling against this advancement in technology, basically, and that's a really interesting aspect to the story as well. When I first read this, actually, for a long time, this was my least favorite of all the Hardy novels until I read those other two. It was cute, but it was pretty boring. Like, not much really happened in this book, and that made me a little disappointed in it and not as intrigued by it as I otherwise might have been. But like I said, the ending really makes this book for me, and I think on reread I would enjoy it more just because I would be aware of that ending. So anyway, it's a very thought-provoking book, which is why it's higher than the other two. But again, I would have liked more from it, similar with A Pair of Blue Eyes. Then we have the first on this list of Hardy's more plot-driven books, and that is A Laodicean. This story follows a girl named Paula who ends up inheriting this castle, and she calls in this young architect named George to basically do some remodeling in this castle. And then there's some other interesting figures who come into play throughout the story. I really found myself very engaged when reading this. It's a very interesting look at architecture. You can tell Hardy has a lot of appreciation for Gothic architecture. He mentions it in several of his books, but specifically in this one it comes up a bit. The most frustrating part about this book, and why it's not higher, is the main character. I really do not like Paula. She is the Laodicean of the title, and if you don't know, a Laodicean is basically someone who's very lukewarm in their faith and in their beliefs. And Paula is definitely someone where throughout the whole story you just don't understand what she wants, what she's trying to do. She's just very lukewarm about everything. She's lukewarm not only in her beliefs, her faith, but also she's very lukewarm when it comes to her relationships. She's not very good at really fully dedicating herself to anything, and it gets really frustrating. And even in the end, there's no real promise that she's changed. Like, she just feels the same. It almost seems to suggest that we need to keep in mind that she is a Laodicean. She's a very lukewarm person. She's not a very devoted person in any way, and that could lead to some unfortunate things potentially in the future. So it gets really frustrating that way, but also interesting. I also feel like, as far as a lot of the other characters in this book, they're not as fully fleshed as I might like. There is one villainous character that is very intriguing, just because the reason why he's villainous is sort of pitiable. Like, you understand that he's in a really unfortunate position, especially for the time. And so it's a really thought-provoking novel, and like I said, very engaging, but I liked a lot of Hardy's other work more. Up next, in the 10th spot, we have The Mayor of Casterbridge. And now this one is one that I think on reread will move up a little bit. My enjoyment will grow a lot more. I think when I read it, I was just not in the best place for it. But for now, it is in the 10th place. I didn't love it, but over time, the more I think about it, the more I appreciate what it did. This story follows a man who, in the first chapter, makes a horrible mistake, and then we follow him 20 years later as he's really trying to remake himself, become a better person, and his past comes back to haunt him. That's all I'm going to say. I have to keep it very vague because spoilery, and even though what happens in the first chapter is in the first chapter, and so you could kind of say, well, it's not super spoilery because it happens in the first chapter. I still feel like it's shocking enough that it would be fun to go into it not knowing. I started off knowing what was going to happen, and it didn't ruin the experience, but I think it could be fun for people who have avoided that spoiler to enter this not knowing it. So anyway, so that's why I'm going to keep it vague. But it's a really fascinating story with very interesting characters. I will say I think part of what threw me off about this book is a lot of Hardy's novels have female main characters. And so this one with a male main character who's older, I think it just threw me off the groove, especially because I had only read Tess and Far From the Madding Crowd before I read this, and both of those have female leads. And I had just come back, I guess it was like a little less than a year after I came home from my religious mission, and that breaking up and me just starting to get back into classics, I think that made it even harder to really get into this because I was expecting something similar to the other two I had read by Hardy, and this is pretty different. I mean, there's a lot of similarities as far as Hardy's tone and atmosphere and his exploration of countryside and small towns and stuff, but it's, like I said, it follows a male lead who's older, and yeah, it just has a bit of a different focus than what I had been used to. But it is an interesting look at family and loyalty and changing oneself and if it's possible, and how can someone really change and become better, and how can someone overcome their mistakes. So it's a really interesting exploration of that topic, and again, I think on reread I'll enjoy it more. I just think the timing was not great for me to read this one. In the 11th spot, we have Two on a Tower. Now this may be strange for people who have read this and Mayor of Casterbridge, because Mayor of Casterbridge is definitely a better book objectively, I would say. It was one of his later books, so it would make sense. But this one, I don't know. I feel like Mayor of Casterbridge, when I read it, I had a mainly negative feeling towards it because I was disappointed after reading Far From the Madding Crowd and Tess and loving them. But with this one, I didn't know how to feel about it, and honestly to this day I still don't really know how to feel about it, but that's what puts it more in the middle, is because I liked it. I didn't hate it when I read it, or I didn't have really negative feelings. I just was a little confused, I guess. This follows a woman who is married and her husband has kind of abandoned her. He's a very possessive man, and so he told her before he left, basically, don't do anything without me. And so she's just kind of been alone for a couple years and just is really lonely. She's in her late 20s, but she ends up meeting this young boy, this boy who wants to be an astronomer in the town. He's around 21, I believe, and she finds herself attracted to him and is also curious about his work, and so things kind of spiral on from there. But what really makes this interesting to me is, first of all, the main character, Viviette is her name, Viviette Constantine, is a really interesting character, and I feel like I didn't totally grasp how interesting and pitiable she was until the ending. The ending really made it clear to me that her life was just really unfortunate and sad, and I just didn't catch on. It also made me laugh. This book made me laugh because Swithin, the boy, the man, is just so oblivious to romance, completely oblivious, and it's pretty humorous in a lot of ways. I also found the idea of these two being kind of like star-crossed lovers with this astronomy kind of aspect to it was really interesting. I liked how that worked together. I think what threw me off most about this book was the ending, which I just didn't love how the ending played out, but I also didn't hate it. I feel like I saw some interesting aspects to it, and like I said, it did add interest to me for the main female character, but I think it kind of ruined Swithin, the male character, for me. I think that's why it's so confusing, because I feel like I appreciated the female lead better after that, and I disliked the male lead more, or I was disappointed more in the male lead. So it just kind of threw off a lot of things for me, but it's an interesting story. I don't think it's for everyone. It's definitely very melodramatic, so if you want something dramatic, this is great to read. I like some melodrama. I think it definitely depends on my mood, and I think when I read this, it was just the right time for that sort of thing, but I don't know. This is a very strange one, I will say that. But I don't know, there were things I did really like about it, and like I've mentioned before, I like some dramas, and this definitely has that. So anyway, in fact, I think I accidentally said that was 11th place, but it was 9th, and now we move into number 8, which is Desperate Remedies. This is the second of Hardy's 3 plot-driven novels, and I believe it was his first published novel, so I definitely can tell that the writing style is not as good as it becomes over time. But it's a really fun mystery-based story, very dramatic. This starts off following a young girl and her brother whose father ends up dying in an accident, and they end up having to seek out professions, they seek out ways to make money, and the brother has kind of a profession. He's been trained under his father to do certain things, so he kind of follows that path, whereas Cytherea, the main female character, ends up kind of going a different route and becomes a companion for this older woman also named Cytherea, who may or may not be connected to their father. And so that's all I'm going to say about this. But there are other characters and events that occur that kind of take the story in a pretty different direction towards the middle of the book from what I just explained. So keep that in mind going into it, that it does start off with that synopsis that I just explained, but it does kind of take a turn partway through, but which is part of why I think it feels really all over the place and scattered for a lot of people, and some people I think have a hard time with it because of that, but I think it's a lot of fun. I think the characters are really interesting. I feel like this is one of few instances where the romance ends up looking like it's probably going to be pretty happy overall, as opposed to looking like we're not sure if it's gonna make it. So that's really nice, and just overall, it's just a fun, sensational story. It's definitely, if you like sensation novels, if you like Wilkie Collins and have not read Hardy yet, I think this is a good place to start, just because it does have, it kind of combines Hardy with some little Wilkie Collins-esque things going on, which again, can feel kind of chaotic and over-the-top dramatic, but I really enjoy it. So yes, in the 8th spot, we have that one. After talking about the first book Hardy published, I'm going to jump to number 7 on my list, which is the last book he published, and that is Jude the Obscure. This is the one I most recently read for Victober, and while I did really enjoy it, there were things that bothered me. Objectively, the writing is incredible. This is a very well put together story. The character development is fascinating. In this, we follow a young man named Jude who becomes, from a young age, becomes obsessed with the idea of Christminster, which is basically like a college that's sort of meant to represent like Oxford kind of a place. And he's really fascinated by this school and really wants to attend. But he gets a lot of roadblocks in his way. It has a lot of discussion about marriage and whether it's possible to be happy in marriage. Jude himself ends up in an unhappy marriage that is one of his roadblocks to getting to the school that he wants to get to. And it's a really, like I said, the character development is very well done and fascinating. The exploration of marriage is interesting and very thought-provoking. It is very tragic. A lot of people say it's more tragic than Tess. I will say that Jude has an event that is more tragic than anything that happens in Tess, I would say. But throughout the story, I feel like Tess has more longer lasting tragedy, like one tragedy after another, a little bit more in Tess. Whereas this, it's more melancholy throughout the story, but there's not quite as many intense tragic scenes as there are in Tess, if that makes sense. So I feel like Tess overall has more tragedy throughout, but this one has a more tragic event in it, if that makes sense. But anyway, my biggest complaint about this and why it's not higher on the list is because Jude just honestly bothered me at a lot of points. A lot of the roadblocks that get in the way for him to be able to go to the school he wants to are things that if he really fought hard, he might have a chance of overcoming them. I'm not going to say for sure he would, but I think there's potential there if he wanted to fight for it, but he doesn't fight for it. That's the thing, is he does not fight for what he feels like he deserves, for what he really wants. Instead, as soon as things don't go the way he thinks they should, he just kind of gives up and then complains about the world working against him. And it's just really frustrating. Like, I feel like he doesn't understand what it actually takes to get into the school. He just likes the idea of it, and he figures, if I study enough, I'm sure to get in. That's frustrating. And then even if he couldn't get into the school, there were things he could have done to find joy in life. He could have had a better attitude about the opportunities he was given, and he just does not have a good attitude about it. And I just feel like he does nothing to really try to help himself, and that's beyond frustrating, as opposed to the female main character, who I feel like actually is willing to do what she can to make her life better. I think by the end, it kind of, life works against her in a lot of ways. I think it's similar to Tess in the fact that both this female character, Sue, and Tess really try to find some sort of level of joy and just being able to push forward and find a profession or a career that they at least enjoy to some extent, that there's some joy in doing, and are more willing to accept what opportunities life does provide for them and make the most of them, whereas Jude just kind of whines about everything. So that was something that did bother me, but again, this was a very thought-provoking book. It's very well written, definitely one of Hardy's best written novels, and the character development, incredible. It just had a few things that I just didn't agree with, that I didn't love as much, so it held it back a little bit, but it was a pretty good read. Then spot number 6, we have The Trumpet Major. Now this is one that objectively is not as good as Jude the Obscure, for example, but I just love it. Like, thinking back to this reading experience, reading this book, I really loved it. I loved the characters and that exploration. I feel like Hardy has a lot of books that focus on that love triangle aspect, and I just feel like this is one of his best versions of that as far as the characters themselves and how they interact with each other. I found it interesting. This is probably, of Hardy's more sweet novels, this is probably the Hardy novel I like best of those. I feel like this, A Laodicean, A Pair of Blue Eyes, Under the Greenwood Tree kind of all fall under a similar vein in my mind, and this one just is the best of them. I really, really love this one. It sets during the Napoleonic War, so it's a bit of a historical fiction, even at the time when it was written. And we follow a young girl who's in love with a brother, but there's another brother who comes into town and falls in love with her as well, these two brothers. And yeah, it's just kind of a love triangle romance. There's also another character who falls for her, although she feels nothing for him, and he just adds to the drama. And it's just a wonderful, delightful read, exploring these characters, but also exploring the idea of the power of war and how present war always is, regardless of how free and happy you are in the moment. When war is going on, there's always that level of fear in the air, of tension in the air. No matter how much you try to forget, it's always there. And so that's explored really interestingly in this story. It's just a delight. I just love this book so much. I really, really want to reread this. In fact, this may be one of the first I reread by Hardy once I start doing that. I really need to reread Tess, which we'll get to in a little bit, but this one for sure I would love to reread because it's just great. I don't think it will be for everyone. It's definitely a quieter, sweeter story, but I don't know, it just worked for me. I just really enjoyed it. And now, getting into the top 5, we have The Hand of Ethelberta, which I've mentioned a couple times, I feel like this month, maybe just once, in Kate Howe's little collaboration video for recommendations for underrated classics, for underrated Victorian classics. I mentioned this one, and it's so good. It's my 5th favorite Hardy novel. It's super humorous, while also being very thought-provoking, as Hardy often is, at least for me. This story follows Ethelberta, who is the daughter of a butler, and I believe her mother, at least for a time, did work as a housemaid. And she ends up, before the book begins, in a marriage with a wealthy gentleman who ends up dying not long after their marriage. And so we start off the book with her in this situation, and her mother-in-law agrees to continue to take care of her, to provide for her, but she's not allowed to maintain ties with her family. She has to basically cut them off. She can't communicate with them. She can't tell anyone where she came from. She just has to rely on her mother-in-law, and she agrees to this, although she does sneak away to talk to her family here and there. And this story is essentially about her figuring out what she wants in life. She's balancing her family's expectations with her mother-in-law's expectations with her own desires, and she's trying to figure it out. There are several suitors that are trying to win her hand, and she also has an interest in storytelling. She wants to be a storyteller, and she sees some success with that. And yeah, like I say, she's really just trying to figure out what she wants out of life, what will bring her the most contentment. And it's a really interesting exploration of that, especially when it comes to marriage and what in marriage will actually make you happy, and is it possible to find a marriage where you'll be happy? It's not as intense and dramatic as Jude is on that topic for sure, but it's a very interesting book. I really, really enjoy it, and would definitely recommend it if you have not read it before. In spot number 4, we have Far from the Madding Crowd. Now, I'm not going to lie, this and the third place could probably switch depending on my mood, but for now I'm just going to put this one as number 4. This story follows Bathsheba Everdeen as she ends up in possession of a farm. We also follow Gabriel Oak to some extent, who does fall in love with her while she's poor, and unfortunately things don't work out between them, and he ends up losing his farm and has to go off to seek employment elsewhere, and things go on from there for both of these individuals. And it's a really interesting exploration of country life, of women's position, that's so well explored in this. Hardy explores that pretty interestingly in a lot of his novels, but this one in particular I feel like really explores that well. And also the exploration of what real love is, whether there's 3 suitors in Bathsheba's life, and they each represent a different type of love, I would say, and it's really interesting to see how each of these types of love kind of impact her life and where they each lead her. I think the only reason why this isn't higher, it used to be my second favorite before I read 2 others this year that I'll get to in a moment, but the thing that pulls it down a little bit compared to those other 2 for me is the fact that there's a lot of time spent with the countrymen, and while there's something nice about it, it's just enough that it does get a little boring. So we're kind of following some of the local farm hands as they like have conversations and go to the bar and whatnot, and it's just a little boring to me, I'm going to be honest. I also think Bathsheba, while she's fascinating, she also can be a little frustrating at times. So those things combine to kind of hold me back from totally like putting this up in second or even first place. But I do really, really enjoy this story. I love the film from 2012, absolutely, or 2015, I mean, excuse me. It just has wonderful atmosphere, and it definitely is a very fall type story in my opinion. So if you need something to read for next Victober and you have not read this, definitely do. I would say honestly this is one of the best places to start with Hardy in my opinion, because I think it gives a lot of the themes he likes to explore, it explores well. I also feel like the exploration of the love triangle or love shape, it shows how Hardy does it so well, and it also explores his nature writing and things like that really well too. So I feel like you get a good taste of a lot of things Hardy does in this book. So definitely if you haven't read Hardy yet, this is a good one to start with. And now getting to top 3, we have, like I said, I think Far from the Madding Crowd and this next book probably could switch places depending on my mood. But for now, for number 3, we have The Return of the Native, which is a wonderful story I read earlier this year. We follow in this Eustacia Vi, who is a very interesting character. She kind of reminds me, for those who have read Wuthering Heights, she reminds me a little bit of Catherine Earnshaw. Not exactly the same, but a lot of her personality kind of reminds me of Kathy's personality in a lot of ways. But she is a very interesting and dynamic and manipulative woman, and we follow her as she falls in love with different people. She very much craves attention, and she ends up falling for Clem, who is a man who grew up in this area, but he has gone away to school and is now coming back. So he represents exploring the world and enjoying diverse things throughout, exotic things throughout the world, and that's what Eustacia wants. Unfortunately, however, he does not actually want that out of life, and so we see how that impacts their relationship and other relationships in the story. This is a very gothic feeling story. Not only does Eustacia Vi remind me of Catherine, but also the atmosphere in this book really reminds me of Wuthering Heights. The story itself is not like Wuthering Heights, I will say that. It's not like Wuthering Heights, and not all the characters are like Wuthering Heights characters, but there is a little bit of that vibe to the story, a little bit of that atmosphere. There's a lot of supernatural things going on. There's mentions of accusations of witchcraft and a lot of just other very interesting things. Most of the story actually takes place in the evening or at night. There are very few scenes that are during the day, which I think adds to that atmosphere. And it really is a wonderful book. Honestly, the more I talk about this, the more I feel like, yes, it is above Far from the Madding Crowd. It's a wonderful story. It is. So definitely one I would recommend as well. I honestly would say you could start with this if you really wanted to as well, especially if you like Wuthering Heights. It may be a good place for you to start with Hardy. It's just a great read, and one I'm excited to revisit in the future, because I think this is another one where my love for it will continue to grow over time. Number 2, my second favorite Hardy novel of all time, is one I also read earlier this year, and that is The Woodlanders. And this one is one that I understand it not working for everyone, but the way it addresses a lot of the themes that Hardy often considers in his books, it's just so well done to me. Like, I love how he addresses it in a lot of things like marriage and connection to nature and education, and how that impacts a person's contentment, especially when they grew up in this small, simple village. How getting an education can really kind of ruin that for you because you experience so many other things. And yeah, there's just a lot of exploration of those things, and the way it's done in this book compared to a lot of Hardy's other novels, I feel like it's explored very well in this book. I really, really like all the characters in this book, all their relationships and how they connect to each other. At first, I actually didn't love, what's the main character's name? Grace. I didn't love Grace to begin with because I felt like she felt kind of flaky, but as the book went on, I just recognized her strength dealing with the things she ends up having to deal with, and really trying to find that balance between loyalty to her family and to herself, while also trying to consider her own desires and what she wants out of life on her own, and also considering the situations and the context she ends up in, how she deals with all of those things and balancing all of those things, and I really found myself impressed by her. The other character that really intrigues me in this book is Marty, who is we start off actually meeting her first, but she's a very quiet background character, and yet when you really think about her role and what she was putting up with in the background, and the contrast she provides for Grace, it's really interesting. This is just a very thought-provoking book and very interesting. The plot itself is engaging enough to just keep you reading, but on top of that, it has a lot of interesting things to think about. And I think on reread, I'm going to see even more things to think about because there's just so much to talk about with this book, and I just absolutely love it. So second favorite Hardy of all time. And last, of course, this video is way longer than I hoped it would be, but we'll try to make this last one quick. My number 1 favorite Hardy novel is the first one I ever read, and that is Tess of the Derbervilles. I love this book so much. I want to reread it so bad. I've been waiting until I could finish all of Hardy's other novels. I have reread it once, so I've read it twice so far. But I've been waiting till I finished the other Hardy novels before I could reread this, and it's finally time. I'm so excited. I don't know when I'm going to reread it, but hopefully soon, because I love this book so much. This book follows Tess, who ends up in a really unfortunate situation. It's basically her dealing with it and society's judgment of her. and the exploration is so wonderful. Hardy was definitely a man ahead of his time, and you can see that in a lot of his books, but especially in this book and how he deals with certain topics in this book. Tess herself is an incredibly strong and wonderful character. I absolutely adore her. There is so much in this to inspire so much emotion, positive and a lot of negative. It's a very tragic story. There are happy moments. Yeah, there's just a lot of tragedy and frustration, but it's just so good. It's just so well done, so incredible. Hardy himself actually said that his favorite character he ever wrote was Tess. I also love that the tagline for this is actually Tess of the Derbervilles, a pure woman. I added that in my copy here. I don't know if you can see that very well right there, but I just think that says so much about this story and what it's supposed to be showing about society at this time and about Tess as a character. And I feel like this is one where Hardy could have just floated on the themes and on the topic that he was addressing, on this topic of women and their reputations. But instead of just floating on that, he actually created a wonderful story with wonderful, well-developed characters that make you feel a lot of emotions. And I just absolutely love it. It's so good, so amazing. It is very tragic, I know, but it's so well done. It's just so good. It's so freaking good. I want to reread it so bad. So that is it. That is my ranking for all of Hardy's novels. Let me know down below your thoughts on these books. Let me know if you have any questions about like recommendations or anything that I can give you. I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for watching. Happy Victober, and I will see you next time. Bye!